in the sterile environment of St. Matthew's Children's Hospital, where cartoon murals and pastel colors attempted to mask the pervasive sadness. Room 308 held a particular silence, the kind that exists only where hope has nearly vanished. Dr. James Wilson stood at his son's bedside, shoulders slumped and eyes reddened behind his glasses. Despite being one of the country's finest pediatric oncologists, he had been defeated by this Kaseha's own 8-year-old son, Oliver, who lay pale, bald, and too weak to lift his head. Oliver's acute myeloid leukemia had resisted chemotherapy, experimental drugs, and prayers whispered in countless languages by friends and strangers alike. James watched the monitor's slow rhythm and his son's fragile chest rising and falling like a paper-thin wave, and he wept silently. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Turning, he expected a nurse, but instead saw a young black boy, perhaps 10 years old, standing in the doorway. The boy wore jeans that were too short and a slightly worn shirt. His deep brown eyes seemed older than his years, and his volunteer badge read Elijah. James quickly wiped his face and composed himself. "Can I help you, kid?" Elijah stepped in, glancing at Oliver before returning his gaze to the doctor. "I came to see your son," he said softly. James raised an eyebrow. "He's not taking visitors, but I know how to help him," Elijah replied. The words were so bold, so certain, that James actually chuckled in disbelief. "You know how to cure cancer. That's rich." Elijah didn't smile. "No, but I know what he needs." James stood, his expression hardening. "Listen, I appreciate your kindness, but I've spent the last 2 years trying everything. I've traveled to Germany, talked to specialists in Japan. You think walking in here with a hopeful look is going to fix this? I don't have hope," Elijah replied. "I have something real." James sighed and turned away. "Please leave." But Elijah didn't move. Instead, he walked toward the bed slowly, as if he had done this before. James stepped forward. "What are you?" "He's scared," Elijah said, cutting him off and looking directly at Oliver. "Not just of dying. He's scared of you seeing him like this." James froze as Elijah gently took Oliver's frail hand in his. "I was sick too," Elijah whispered. "Worse than him. I didn't talk for a year. No one knew what was wrong with me. They thought it was brain damage, but it wasn't. I just saw something I couldn't explain." James folded his arms. "What did you see?" Elijah looked up. "Light, and something behind it. It spoke to me, not with words, with feeling. It said I had to come back, that I wasn't done, that I had to help him." James stared, stunned. "You think this is a game?" he snapped. "You think walking in here and feeding him nonsense is going to change anything?" Elijah didn't flinch. He closed his eyes and whispered something inaudible. Oliver stirred for the first time in days. His hand moved. James blinked in surprise. "Oliver," Elijah whispered again, this time touching Oliver's forehead. Suddenly, the boy's eyes opened, slightly awake but open. "Daddy," Oliver croaked. James rushed forward. "Oliver, can you hear me?" Oliver nodded faintly. James looked to Elijah, shaken. What did you do?" "I reminded him why he's still needed here," Elijah replied. "But he has to want it too." James swallowed hard. "This doesn't make sense. You're not a doctor, you're a volunteer, a child." "I'm more than that," Elijah said softly. "Ask Nurse Thompson. She knows my story." Before James could respond, Elijah turned and walked out of the room. When James asked the nurses who had let him in, one looked confused. "No one," she said. "Elijah hasn't volunteered here in months. He moved out of state last year after beating a rare neurological disorder. Doctors called it a miracle." James stood in the hallway, stunned. In room 308, Oliver was sitting up, asking for juice. The next morning, room 308 was filled with quiet wonder. Oliver was awake and not fully recovered, not miraculously cured overnight, but alert, talking, and for the first time in months, smiling. His cheeks had a hint of color. He asked for crackers, laughed at a nurse's silly joke, and even reached out to hold his father's hand like he used to when he was little. And afraid of thunderstorms, Dr. James Wilson didn't know what to do with himself. He'd spent the entire night reviewing charts, test results, and medication logs. Nothing had changed, no new drugs, no last-ditch procedures, but Oliver had improved on his own. Well, not quite on his own. James couldn't get the boy out of his head. Elijah, the 10-year-old who had appeared in his son's room, said something no one could hear, touched his forehead, and changed everything. The boy who, according to the volunteer records, hadn't been at St. Matthew's in over a year. James sat down with Nurse Thompson, his voice low, his heart pounding. "Tell me about Elijah." She looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked. "Because he was in Oliver's room yesterday. He said he knew how to help him. I thought he was just another kid with a good heart, but now I don't know what to believe." Nurse Thompson hesitated, then set down her clipboard. "Elijah came here when he was 4, she said. No diagnosis. Couldn't walk, couldn't speak. He was in a coma for 7 months. We called him our sleeping angel." James leaned in. "They said it was neurological, some rare viral inflammation. We tried everything, nothing worked. Then one night, during a lightning storm, he just woke up." James blinked. "Just like that?" She nodded, sat up and said one word: light. "That's all, just light. But after that, he got better, like his body had remembered how to heal. The therapist called it spontaneous remission. The neurologist couldn't explain it. But his mother believed something bigger had happened." James's mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" She said when he was unconscious, she sat beside him every day, prayed, spoke to him. One day, she said she felt something in the room with him, warm, loving, like someone had walked in from another world. The next morning, he woke up. James stared at the floor. She said Elijah was changed after that. Thompson continued. More sensitive, like he could feel things other people couldn't. A year later, he asked her to bring him to hospitals, to kids who were sick. He'd just sit with them, hold their hand, sometimes say a word. And strange things started happening. "They got better," James whispered. "Some did, some didn't. But the ones who did said the same thing, that he reminded them they weren't alone." James sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. "And where is he now?" he asked. Thompson looked away. They moved quietly. The mom didn't want attention. "Last I heard, they went somewhere in the mountains." Said Elijah needed quiet. That night, James sat beside Oliver's bed, holding his son's hand as he drifted to sleep. "Do you remember the boy who came yesterday?" he asked. Oliver nodded. "He told me something before he left." "What was it?" "He said, 'Your dad's going to be okay now.'" James blinked. "I thought you were the one who needed healing." Oliver smiled faintly. "No, it was you." James couldn't speak because, in that moment, he realized he had been broken too, not just by his son's illness, but by the years of carrying the burden alone, of being a man of science who couldn't save the one he loved most. He had forgotten what it meant to believe in something bigger than himself. 3 weeks later, Oliver was discharged. The scans weren't perfect. The cancer was still present, but stable, something doctors rarely saw in cases like his. His appetite returned. He began to draw again. He asked to go outside to feel the wind on his face. And Jamesh changed too. He stopped seeing miracles as fairy tales. He began sitting longer with his patients, listening more than talking, holding hands instead of holding charts. He even started a foundation in Oliver's name, focused on holistic healing, emotional therapy, and the role of presence in recovery. They called it the Elijah Project. One summer, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a photo. Elijah, now older, stood on a hillside holding a small lamb. His smile hadn't changed. Taped to the back of the photo was a note. "Healing doesn't always mean curing. Sometimes it just means remembering why you're still alive." James framed it and placed it in his office, right beside a photo of Oliver holding a stethoscope. Today, Oliver is in remission, and Dr. James Wilson, once the skeptic, tells his patients about the boy who reminded him that medicine may treat the body, but love, connection, and belief, they awaken the soul.